Okay, we're live.
Hi, everybody. Welcome to the October edition of the Wikimedia Tech Talks. Today we have Roan Kattouw, Principal Software Engineer on the product team, talking about ResourceLoader tips and tricks. You can follow us on the YouTube stream live that's listed here as well, and you can ask questions there as well as on the IRC office channel. I'll be collecting answers throughout the talk, and we will answer them at the end. Talk should go about 45 minutes, so we should have plenty of time at the end for questions and answers. If there's anything that we don't get to or something that comes up later, feel free to let me know, and we can talk with Roan to get that answer for you. And without further ado, here's Roan.
All right. Can everybody hear me and stuff?
Yes.
Excellent. And then can I get my slides as well?
Yeah, feel free to present them now.
Oh, it thinks it's still presenting me.
Okay.
Present them.
Oh, there we go. I saw it, and then we just lost.
Sorry, I just stopped. Yeah.
Yeah.
That's it. Share them again.
Cool.
All right, here we go. So I will be talking about tips and tricks for using ResourceLoader. And so I'll start with just like a basic introduction. As hopefully most of you know, ResourceLoader is our asset management system in MediaWiki. So it's what lets you load JavaScript and CSS and other front-end assets on a page. And just as an introduction, I'll first walk through some of the basic things, but then we'll get into some of the fun, more advanced things that you can do with ResourceLoader, and also some of the newer features that we introduced this year and how they work and why we want you to use them. So starting with the basics, ResourceLoader revolves around modules. So a module is a piece of front-end stuff. So here's an example definition of a module. This is in the resources.php file in core. As you can see, this module contains some JavaScript files, it contains a CSS file, it contains some internationalization messages, and it has a dependency. And we'll go into each of those components. But what this is this is called jQuery.confirmable, and it's a library for giving the user a confirmation prompt. And other, so modules can either be something library-like that other code can use, or they can just be functionality that you want to load somewhere. So here's a different example of a module definition. This is what it looks like if you have to do an extension of JSON, where of course you're writing this in JSON and not in PHP. This example is in Multimedia Viewer, where they have a module called Tipsy Dialog, which is a particular dialog thing that they have. I don't even know exactly what it is. And you can see this one also has a JavaScript file, a less file, because that's also supported, and a number of other modules that it depends on. So then when you've defined a module, you've defined a bundle of stuff, a bundle of scripts and styles, et cetera, that you want to load in some situations, you have to tell ResourceLoader to actually load it. So on the PHP side, when you're rendering a page and you have an output page object, so you're in like a special page or in a before pages play hook or a place like that, you can call add modules on the output page object and tell it which module or modules to load, and then that will get loaded. In this example, that is the HTML form code from MediaWiki. You can also do lazy loading of modules from within JavaScript. So if if you discover later that you need something, or if you have a module that is really big and you only want to load it when the user interacts with your feature, for example, if they open Visual Editor, they click Edit, and then you realize that you need to load all this code because they want to use Visual Editor now, you can use MW-loader using for that. So you can tell it which module or modules you want to load. It gives you a promise, and then that promise gets resolved when the module that you asked for has loaded and that code is available. So In this example, this lazy loads table sorter code, and then when it arrives, it applies a table sorter to a thing. Another thing that is maybe not as well known, but that is also pretty fundamental and that I want more people to understand is the notion of render blocking CSS. So you saw that a lot of these modules that I showed before had both JavaScript and CSS in them. And that's suitable for when the CSS is only needed to style the things that the JavaScript does or creates. But there's also some CSS that you need just to render the initial page, like the skin CSS, like the CSS that makes the sidebar and that makes the tabs at the top of the page and it makes the links at the top right and all those kinds of things. That is CSS that you need even when there's no JavaScript, just to render the HTML that comes out of your PHP code. And that CSS we make render blocking, which means it loads very early, and it gets loaded before the browser paints anything. And that's because it's so important that if you try to render the HTML without it, it would just be a mess. So obviously this should be used sparingly because of the performance implications of loading it so early that everything else is blocked on it. But you should also use it when it's needed. So for things that do require this CSS very early, you should make it render blocking. Otherwise, you will get a flash of unstyled content. The page will first load without a CSS, it will look ugly, and then it will jump as the CSS arrives, it will fix itself. And that's not an experience that you want. So this is definitely something to be judicious about, but also don't be afraid to use it when you do need it. Just check these criteria to see whether you do or not. Dealing with render blocking CSS is a little bit different in ResourceLoader. The way you do it is you put the CSS that you need to be render blocking in a separate module that only contains CSS, that has no dependencies. It doesn't have scripts, it doesn't have anything else, just CSS. And you use add module styles instead of add modules to add it. So one thing that you'll frequently see is that the same component registers two modules, one for the essential render blocking styles and one for all the other stuff that can come later. So the JavaScript and the CSS that goes with that JavaScript. So that's what you see in this code snippet. MediaWiki Action Edit is the module that has the JavaScript and the CSS that goes with that JavaScript and the messages and all the stuff that you need for dynamic things. And MediaWiki Action Edit.styles is the essential styles that need to be render blocking. And that is, they have to be separate modules because they have to be loaded in different ways, as you can see over here. And if you try to use that module styles with a module that contains anything that's not CSS, you will get an error message. Another pretty fundamental thing that we have in ResourceLoader module is internationalization messages. And this is probably a pretty familiar concept if you have ever written any PHP code in MediaWiki, because we make everybody use this. But I'll just go over it real quick. You can define translatable messages in en.json, both in core and extensions. And those messages can be translated into other languages, and they can have parameters like this example, uploaded : and then a parameter. That message has a symbolic name. In this case, that's multimedia viewer -daytime -uploaded. You can then, when you create a module, so this is an example module definition and extension.json. The module definition has a list of messages that are needed by that module, so you put it in that list. That means that module gets shipped over to the client side, and your JavaScript can then use it. And you end up writing code like this, where you call MW message, give it the name of the message that you want, you give it the parameter, and then you tell it whether you want text or HTML from it. And now you will have a parameterized translated message in your JavaScript. And this is something that we also have a PHP library for, and the way that you use it in JavaScript is mostly the same, except that you have to add the message to the module definition, otherwise it won't work. And so this means that internationalization messages are also a core component of a module, along with scripts and styles. Another thing that most people know about is that your CSS can get flipped. So on the left is a screenshot from English Wikipedia from a couple days ago, and on the right is a screenshot of Arabic Wikipedia, and you can see that it's basically a mirror image, and almost everything is mirrored. The sidebar is on the right instead of on the left. The tabs flow from right to left. The icon, oh, this actually doesn't have a flipped search icon. The magnifying glass icon is not flipped, but I think in the past it has been. Some icons are flipped. The direction of absolutely everything is flipped. And this has implications for how you write your CSS. So we used to write a separate override style sheet for right-to-left languages that was always out of date and always a pretty crappy experience. But with ResourceLoader, you can just write CSS from a left-to-right perspective. And when your page is viewed in a right-to-left language, we will automatically take care of flipping things for you. So when you write float right, that becomes float left. When you write padding left, that becomes padding right. When you write these like 4-value like margin padding or border rules with different values, we know that the second one is the right one and the fourth one is the left one, and so we switch those around. And if you put things like -left or -LTR in your image names, we will flip that to -right or -RTL and pick the other one. So if you have images like that magnifying glass or arrows or certain other things that need to be reversed in RTL, we won't actually go and reverse the image for you ourselves, but you can make a RTL version of the image, encode it in the file name this way, and then we will load the other one when appropriate. So that's a pretty cool feature that I hope most people know about, but also pretty fundamental for to understand how ResourceLoader works and what kinds of implications it has. All right, so that was the basic stuff. Let's get into some of the more advanced stuff and stuff that not everybody knows you can do. This is not always going to be useful to everybody all the time, but it's good to know that it's there. So for example, you can have style files, so CSS or less files in your module. You can also have skin-specific style files in your module. So in this example, this is an example from Echo. We have a style file over here that is always used, but we also have style files specific to each skin, one for Minerva, one for Monobook, and one for Vector down there. And so this definition is pretty intuitive. It's pretty intuitive what this does. And you don't always need it, but when you do, you'll be glad it's there. More obscure is that you can also do this for scripts. You can have JavaScript files that are only loaded in certain skins. So this is a bit of a weird example, but here there's one file that gets loaded in the Minerva skin, and then a different file that gets loaded in every other skin that's not Minerva, is what this definition means. You can even do this with languages. You can have different scripts that load in different languages. This is not used very often. Video.js apparently use it because that's where I took this example from. And things like Moment.js, which is a timestamp rendering library, use this. It's not super common, but you might see it around sometimes. And you know, one in 100 times you will actually need to use this, and then you'll be glad it's there. Another thing that's a little bit more commonly useful is template support. So in addition to scripts, styles, and messages as resources in a module, you can also add a template as a resource. So in this example, I added an HTML file, thumbnail.html, as a template to a module. And when you do that, that HTML file gets loaded along, and it means you can write JavaScript like this, where you call mwtemplate.get with the module name and the template file name, and you call .render, and now you have a jQuery object that has the parsed HTML from the template, and you can go and fill in a bunch of your placeholders with stuff and then put it in DOM, which is what this code does. This is not really normal templating as you might be used to. So we also have support for Mustache templates, which are more like actual templating. So you can write a file called foo.mustache that looks like this, with which actual template syntax with parameters and stuff. And you can, I think you can write like if statements and simple loops and stuff. And you can also put that in your module. I didn't show the example here, but the syntax is the same as the previous slide. You just have a .mustache extension instead of a .html extension. And the client side uses also the same, except you have to give the render function you have to tell what you want the parameters to be replaced with. And so the result of this will be a JavaScript object that is a link with that URL title and label filled in for the parameter values in a template. And obviously, this is a simple example, but there are more advanced uses of this out there where people have large HTML structures with many parameters that they fill in this way. As an aside, a kind of crazy use of this is that you can also have templates whose file names end in .regexp, and then they're regexes. So this is used, I'm only aware of one place where this is used in the MediaWiki.uri module, where there's some sort of massive regex that needed to be used, and you can include that as a template file. This is pretty obscure. You're not going to need it very often, but it's a nice illustration of the kind of cool stuff that people have figured out how to do. I think this is something that Bartosz came up with like 4 years ago or something. Another fun thing that you can do is you can have internationalized messages in your less style sheet, which seems kind of crazy that you would want translated messages in your styles. But for colon before and colon after content rules, it can be useful. So this is an example from core. You have to have this class ResourceLoader less var file module magic thing. And then there's a less messages property. And what this means is that you can write code like this in your less file, where the variable over here, this msg-showTOC thing, ends up being replaced with text like show table of contents, but translated in whatever language you're viewing this in. So usually we try to put translated and translatable content in the HTML and not in the CSS as much. But in some cases, this can be useful. And so there's a couple of modules here and there that use this. It's a pretty cool trick. And I think John Robson was the one that introduced this like a year or two ago, maybe. And then a volunteer named FOMOFix generalized it to let you use any message in any module this way. All right, so those are some pretty cool advanced things that you can do. They've also been around for a few years. I think the newest thing that I showed you was the less messages thing, and that's from 2017. So now I want to talk about some of the stuff that we introduced earlier this year to do with package modules, which you may have heard about, but I want to go into some more detail on. So something that's existed for longer is that you can use require for like the Node.js, like CommonJS style require function for modules. So for example, in MediaWiki.string.js, which is a library in core, we have this statement at the end where module.exports gets like a bunch of stuff put into it that the module wants to export. And then somewhere else in some file that uses this module, you can write code like this. So this is a lot more like the Node.js style of using things. Most of MediaWiki's JavaScript is written around the idea that your libraries just like put stuff in a global object somewhere, and then you use that global object in your file where you use the library. That's not how modern JavaScript is written anymore. So a while ago, we started supporting this syntax for modules, which is cool, but we figured we could do better. What's new is that you can do require for files now, which is also how a lot of modern JavaScript code is written. So this is an example from, I don't even remember where I pulled this from, where one file has module.exports equals some function in the file, and then another file in the same module just requires that file. And this is a typo. I think I got the file names the wrong way around here. So excuse me for that. But the idea is that you can export something using module.exports in one file, and then require the file from another file and get the thing that was exported. And this is nice because now you don't have to use the global namespace to communicate between separate files in the same module. You do have to do some magic, and we're going to dive into this magic in a second. In your module definition, you have to use this new thing called packageFiles instead of scripts. And so we'll go into that in a minute. But just as an overview, a package module is the term for a module that uses this functionality. So instead of the scripts thing in the module definition, you use package files to indicate that you're using the new feature in a new style. The first file that you list in this list of package files is the entry point. So that is the file that's going to be executed when the module loads. The other files after that, their order doesn't matter, and they're not going to be executed unless something calls require on them. So that's a big difference, because with the scripts, the old style of defining modules with scripts, every file is going to be executed in the order that you listed them. So you have to think about like which files depend on which other files, and you have to think about the right order to execute them all in. And typically the file that does all the work and ties everything together and is sort of like the main orchestration file is typically going to be the last one in your list there. So with package files, that is going to be the first file, and it is going to use require to call other files, and that causes them to be executed. They are not executed in any given order, except through this on-demand mechanism. The other thing to note is that there's a syntax difference to indicate whether you're requiring a module or a file. For a module, you just require the module name. For a file, you have to start with / or / to indicate that to disambiguate, basically, and to indicate that you're trying to require a file. This is a little different. This is compatible with how Node works. It does mean that there's some shorthands that you can use in Node that you can't use here. So you can't require directories, you can't omit file name extensions, that kind of stuff. So everything we let you do on ResourceLoader is compatible with how Node works. It's not the case that everything that Node lets you do, we also let you do, because we are a little bit stricter. And there's a link at the bottom of the slide to a documentation page that explains more, but I'm also going to walk through some of this stuff. So here's a basic example of a module that uses package files that was, I think this is from code that I reviewed a few weeks ago. So this very first file, notifications.js, that's the entry point. So that file is going to be executed first, and that's going to like require a bunch of other files and pull everything together and then do what needs to be done. All these other files, so overlay.js, for example, but also all the other ones, are only going to be executed if and when someone calls require / overlay.js. Hopefully, every file is going to be executed, because hopefully they were all needed. If not, then you are wasting your time putting them in and you're wasting bandwidth, etc. But if through some circumstance you don't ever call require in a file, it won't ever get run. If you require it twice, it will only get run the first time and will just give you a cached result the second time. And the order of the files here is completely meaningless, except for the first one. Files will just get executed in whatever order they're required. Another thing that's important to point out here is that it makes sense when you think about it, but it's going to be a bit of a pitfall sometimes that paths are relative. So here's an example of a module that has files in a bunch of different directories. So the init file is in skins Minerva scripts, but then that has a subdirectory called page issues that some but not all the files are in, and then there's also this file that is in a completely different components directory. And that means that in your init file, this is the kind of thing you see. For the files in the subdirectory, you have to have the subdirectory in the path. And for the file that was in the completely different directory, you have to do .. a bunch of times to get there. This makes a lot of sense, but it's easy. It can be easy to get wrong sometimes. And another thing that makes a lot of sense and it can be easy to get wrong sometimes is that the paths are relative to the file that you're in. So once you've gone into the page issues directory and the init.js file requires the index.js file in that directory, once you're there, the other file in the directory, parse.js, you're already in the directory, so you're not going to have to do / page issues again. The path is relative not to the first file, but to whatever file you're in at that moment. This is also how things work in Node.js, so it should not be a huge surprise, and it does make a lot of sense, but it can be easy to forget sometimes, especially if you're just looking at the module definition a lot and going off of that, or if you're moving files around. So because of that, and because you end up with these kinds of repetitive definitions here, there's a feature to make your life a little bit easier called base paths. So very frequently, so in this example too, you'll see that almost every file is, or actually every file is in the same directory, and they all have this common prefix. And you can write the definition differently so that you put the common prefix in the base path. You have to do this weird incantation with a remote XPath to make ResourceLoader happy. And that differs a little bit between extensions and core, but you can find examples of plenty in the core ResourceLoader file and in extension files. But this allows you to factor out the common prefix, and now your packageFiles definition looks a lot simpler. This is hopefully obvious, and it's clear why you would want this for convenience. But it's about to become a lot more convenient with the next feature that I'll get to in a second. So first, why would you use this? Why would you migrate existing modules over to the system, or why would you write new code using the system? The main reasons for this are that your code structure will be nicer if you don't have to use global objects to sort of transmit classes or functions or whatever it is that you're exporting and transmitting between different files. You won't have to pollute the global namespace a bunch. It's easier to actually keep your functions and classes completely hidden from other people and not make them accessible at all, even in the global namespace. And it's easier to see which file a thing came from or which files your file depends on, because you can just search for these require calls and see which files get required from which file, which is hopefully not too hard if you use like a consistent naming scheme with the old method, but this makes it a lot easier. You also don't have to think endlessly about whether your files are listed in the right order, and you don't get bugs from listing your files in the wrong order, because you might try to use something that's not been defined yet, or worse, you might have a sort of circular dependency and have things break even worse. With require, you don't have those problems. And you also will not have to adjust your module definition because you change which file depends on which file. And a lot of people that have used this have said that it made their code a lot better and more readable. I didn't even realize this would happen until after I implemented the feature, and I saw one of the patches from one of my team members who converted some of this code to the system, and I was like, wow, this actually does make things a lot better. All right, so that's cool, but now let's take this a step further. We decided that we were also going to let you require JSON files. So for example, there's this module in MediaWiki core that has special characters that we want you to be able to use in toolbars and stuff for inserting different types of characters. So there's this big JSON file that has like all the different characters and all the different categories of characters. So there's like, here's all the Latin extended characters, and here's all the Greek ones, and here's all the Bengali ones, et cetera, et cetera. Previously, we had to write special code just to get that JSON file embedded in a ResourceLoader module, and it was pretty awkward. Now that's just a core feature. So you can just list a JSON file as one of your package files. Can't be the first file because you can't execute a JSON file, but you can have it as one of the non-first files. And then in a JavaScript file, you can require a JSON file, and that will do exactly what you expect it to do. It will just JSON parse that file and give you the object. So now instead of writing a bunch of weird code that like has PHP that generates JavaScript dynamically, and it was all awkward, we can just add this special characters JSON file to our module as a file, and then just write some JavaScript that says require special characters of JSON, and now you have the object with the dictionary of all the special characters. So this is cool, but we don't have this tremendously often. The reason why this is so life-changing is that we also support virtual JSON files. So this is where things get a little spacey. So this is where I'll start taking more time per slide to explain what I'm showing you. So this module definition, and I'll pick this apart in a second because it has a lot of elements. But the important thing that I'm showcasing here is that it has a virtual JSON file called names.json. So the syntax is a bit weird here, but basically what this is we say there's this file called names.json. It's not a real file, but here's some code that lets you generate the contents of this file. So basically, we're instructing ResourceLoader to pretend that there is a JSON file called names.json and to run this code to determine what is in that file. So in our case, in our case, that is the result of that fetch language names function over there. So this is a virtual file that contains the names of all languages in our current language. So in order to make this work, we use a base path, because things would get pretty awkward otherwise. If we didn't use a base path, then you would be seeing resources/source/media_language/media_language.names.js on the first line, and then for the second file, we would either have to pretend that our fake file is in that same directory, which would get confusing, because then if someone goes looking for that file, it's not actually there, or we would not have a prefix and just call names.json, but then the JavaScript file would have to require /// names.json, which is also not very fun. So this is the reason why I highlighted the base path feature so early. We use it almost always in modules that have virtual files, so that things don't get that awkward. So this over here is a function that returns the contents of this file. So in this case, it's the language names. It's the language names in the language. And so there is a context object that gets passed as parameter so that you can find out some things that you need, like which language are being executed in right now. So with it all, this is basically a replacement for the way that you used to have to do this. Either write some code that like 4 people on Earth understood how to write so that you could put dynamic things in this part of your module, or you had to make this a configuration variable basically and export it through the configuration system so that you could get it with mw.config.get and then language names or something. But this is a way that you can put data in a module, and that is pretty powerful. We're going to see some more applications of that. But this syntax can be confusing, so if people have questions about how it all works, then that would be very understandable. Another hiccup there is that when you're in an extension.json file, you can't, of course, write inline functions in JSON the way that you can in PHP. In the previous example, I had an inline function in the module declaration. You're not going to be able to do that in JSON. So the syntax for that instead is that you put a function somewhere, typically in your hooks class as a static function, and then you just put the name of that function in the extension.json file. And then you write that function that takes a context object and a config object and returns whatever data. So in this case, there is a config.json file in this echo module that I'm using as an example that has that contains a JSON object with 2 keys and values. One is the max notification count that it gets from a static variable somewhere, and one is a config setting that it gets from the config. So this was previously using nwconfig.get. So instead of using nwconfig, this is now bundling this information with that module. That is a nice segue into the shorthand that we put in for config variables. Some of the time you want to have data that is generated by like real code to be in your module, but most of the time, really what you want is just actual config variables. And that's what's happening here in this MediaWiki special block module. So this just needs access to a couple of config variables from the PHP side. And so instead of callback, you could write a callback that takes the config object in the second parameter and then returns an object that has those keys and gets the values in the config object. But that's work. And there's no reason you would do that work if everyone's doing the same thing. So we put in the shorthand syntax where you can just put in a list of config variables that you want, and we will make that happen for you. So now in the block.js file, there is code that just requires the config.json file and then gets the config variables out of it. Previously, this was using nwconfig.get. So let's talk about why you want to use this instead of MWConfig.get, because the old way that a lot of this stuff was supported, especially with config variables, but also with things that were data but not too big and sort of like config variables, is that you registered a ResourceLoader get config vars hook where you added these config variables, and then in your JavaScript code, you could call MWConfig.get and get your variable. The way that this works is that it puts your config variable in something called the startup module. It doesn't really matter what it is. What matters is that it gets loaded on every single page view, and it gets put in that global MWConfig namespace. So this new way using package files has advantages because now your config vars are namespace to your module. So you can give them names that don't have to be globally unique. You don't have to have a long prefix in front of them to make sure that they're globally unique. And you're not polluting that global config object. And they also get loaded only with your modules. So they don't get loaded in every page view. They only get loaded when they're needed. And for config variables in core, this can be a bit different, but for almost all config variables and extensions, they're really only needed for modules from that extension. And the vast majority of them are only needed by one module. So this makes that very suitable for that case in particular. It also means that the data in that config variable gets cached for a longer period of time and doesn't get cached for only 5 minutes, and it doesn't get reevaluated in a hot code path because we have to update it every 5 minutes. There are also cases when you can't use this. You can't use this when you have config variables that depend on data specific to the request. So if there's something that depends on query string parameters or on the page title, or just more broadly on which page you're on, or on which, I should have really put that in the slides, which user is logged in right now, or whether the user is an administrator, or whether the user has a certain right, or all those kinds of things. If you're the only thing that you can use when you're in one of those callbacks for a virtual JSON file is the skin and the language, and that's it. That's the only thing you get. So if you need to look at the page title or the user's identity or the user's rights in order to decide whether they get a certain feature or not, and you're putting that in a config variable, you can't use this feature. You're still going to have to use output page, the add.js config vars and output page. The good news is that you already would not have been able to use ResourceLoader get config vars because that hook has the same constraints as this. So anything that used that before can be migrated, can simply be migrated to the new system. So you can help us by converting your extensions or the code that you maintain to use these new features, especially for exporting config variables or other simple bits of data that you need. Like I said, most config vars are only used in one module. It's often, for the simple case, it's a pretty simple grepping exercise to confirm that it's safe to convert something and then just convert it. And another good thing to start with is to look at your extension's ResourceLoader get config vars hook, see what it exports, and see if you can migrate all of those things and eliminate the hook. I've been able to do that in a few extensions. Secondly, you can use the package files feature and the per file require in new code because we think it results in better code and less global namespace pollution and all those nice things. And thirdly, you can tell us what your experience is using the system, what works well and what doesn't work well. I've already heard from some people that debugging is a bit harder when you use the package file feature. And so we're already thinking about some ways to fix that and make the debugging experience better. But there might be other things, or there might be other reasons why this doesn't work as well for you as it should, or maybe it's awesome and you love it, and we'd like to hear that too. So yeah, tell us. And then let's see. I have some bonus material, but Sarah, how am I on time and on questions?
You have, we have 15 minutes left, and it looks like we have one question so far. So you could probably take a little bit more time for bonus material, and then we could ask the question, or we could ask the question, and then you could do bonus material.
All right, let's start.
Say that again.
Let's do the question first.
Okay, So this is a question on IRC. It might be useful if you look at it. It would be in the Office channel, just because it involves a file name, but I'll go ahead and read it out to you. It says, I note that a lot of virtual file generators are stored in the extension name in paren hooks.php file.
Mm-hmm.
Is that a good practice given that these aren't really hooks?
That's a good question. I don't think that we've really decided yet. The reason that I am doing that and the reason that I'm sort of propagating that is because it's historically where we've put other callbacks from extension.json that aren't really hooks. So extension.json also has a like extension init callback feature where you can register a callback that gets run when your extension is loaded, and that lets you set up global variables and do some other stuff that wasn't like completely migratable from the old extension PHP system to the new extension.json system. Those are also put in hook files. So it has sort of become the dumping ground for random static functions that need to go somewhere. Admittedly, there's only 0 or 1 init extension callbacks for every extension, and there's potentially more of these of these virtual file callbacks. So if people want to start a convention where those go in a different class, I would be very open to that. It's just what we're doing now because that's sort of following the historical pattern, but we didn't really give it much thought, to be honest. I just went with that.
Okay, that looks like for now that's the only question. I don't see anything on the YouTube stream or anything else on the IRC channel. So if you want to share the rest that you have about 14 minutes left, and we can always check for questions after that as well.
All right, so I'll go through the bonus material real quick. I only ended up having time to write 2 bonus slides. So there's really only one topic here, and we'll make sure to upload the slides somewhere, I'm sure. And so this is going to be useful to refer to for people, because the second slide is just going to be huge and have a lot of examples. But another cool thing that you can do that not enough people know about is that you can have what we call icon modules or image modules, which are basically just modules that add OUI icons or insert your favorite icon management system here and that embed a bunch of images. So this is a simple example where you use this class ResourceLoader image module magic thing to say that it's an image module. You indicate the selector pattern for how it should make the class selector for the icon with a name placeholder, and then you just list a bunch of SVG images, and that ends up producing a module whose CSS looks something like the below. It's simplified a bit because there's actually more going on, but that gives you the basic idea. So this is compatible with OUI's icon system, and so if you have custom icons that you want to be able to use OUI icons, this is a very easy and concise way of defining them, and that's what it gets used for a lot. The more complex example is this one, and there's a lot going on here, but I found this example in the wild in Minerva, and it's a pretty great like omnibus example of using every feature that I know exists in this system, and some features that I didn't know existed, honestly. And I didn't even have to contrive this example, I found it. So there's a bunch of different things going on here. For one thing, you can have different RTL or left to right and different and right to left versions of the same icon that will get selected automatically. We saw that you could already do this with CSS flipping if you just wrote icon stuff in CSS, but you can define it this way as well. You can give your icons colors, and I didn't actually know this feature existed until Friday when I made these slides. You can set a default color for your images, and this means that all these images will, this only works for SVGs, but icons should always be SVGs anyways. This means that all things that are normally black will be made this, I think, grayish color that is defined here. You can also define color as variance. So in this example, that's invert, which is set to white. So then you get a white on black version of the icon. But you can also use this to make things red or green or blue, which is something that OUI does for progressive and destructive icons. You can set the variant to be global, which means that every icon gets it, or in this case, we didn't do that, and we only do it for some images. So now this icon can be used in two different ways. You can use the regular clock icon, and you just get a clock icon, or you can use clock-invert, and you get a white on black clock icon. And in this case, they're using the MWUI icon system and naming scheme for the CSS selectors, but if you put in the right naming scheme for the CSS selectors up here, then you can, this also ends up being compatible with OUI's system, and it will automatically invert icons for you if they appear in a place where they need to be, where there's a colored background, the icon needs to be white. So this is a pretty crazy example, but it gives you an idea of how powerful this stuff all is and what you can do with it. And I don't know how much documentation there is, but if you look up the definition of this module, skins, Minerva, icons, images, it does basically everything it can do. So it's a pretty good place to look. All right. And oh yes, and I'm looking at IRC now on my phone. I see that Andrew Otto says that he and Timo recently added a callback program, which is another cool feature that I don't have an example of right now, but it's worth looking at. Amir asks, is there any way to change the value of the virtual JSON file on tests? I want to write some key unit tests for different values of a config variable, but I couldn't find an easy way. That's a really good question that I don't have an offhand answer to, but that's another thing that we should look into improving if it isn't already doable, because you're right that it would be good for especially these more complicated callback functions, the ones that aren't just like, oh, here's a config variable, put it in, but the ones that actually do work. It would be good to be able to test them. And I don't think that we have a great way to unit test those callbacks right now, and it's something I'll probably consult with Timo on, because he knows both more about ResourceLoader and more about unit tests than I do. And that's a combination of things that we'll need here.
Awesome, Roan. I didn't see any other questions, and if you don't have any more bonus stuff, I just wanted to say thank you so much for speaking today. We really appreciate you sharing all this information. It's really, really interesting. And I also wanted to thank Brendan Campbell, Craven, and the AV team. I don't think I thank them enough on these calls or on these tech talks as well. They do so much background work to help make this possible. So is there anything else that you would like to share, Roan, or any additional questions that folks have?
I have nothing else. So unless there are last minute questions, I will keep it at this.
Okay, great. So what I will do is, again, if anybody does have questions on the YouTube stream, maybe you're watching this later, feel free to ask those. I can forward those to Roan. Roan, is it okay for people to reach out directly and ask you questions too?
Yes. Fine.
Okay, great. And then we, as always, just kind of a little plug for Tech Talks. We have this talk every month. This is open to members of our community, as well as staff, anyone who wants to share technical topics. Definitely feel free to reach out, and we'll schedule you in and have you share with the community. All right. Yes. I had the slide up earlier, and you can look at that, and that has information about how you can sign up for those as well. So again, thank you everyone for attending today. Thanks for everyone helping, and thanks for everyone who asked questions. Okay, bye.